Laura's early morning shifts at the petrol station were a blend of routine solitude and occasional moments of unexpected strangeness. When she started working at the station during her time at Loughborough University, her schedule was demanding but predictable. She would wake up at 5 a.m., groggy from a night of studying or preparing for the day ahead, and drag herself to the station by 6 a.m. For most students, mornings were reserved for sleep or leisurely breakfasts, but Laura's were filled with the hum of machinery and the quiet rhythm of preparing for the day's rush. Her shift would run from 600 a.m. until noon, and by then the morning rush of commuters and early risers would have already passed. After that, the station would quiet down, offering her a few hours of peace before she had to head to her afternoon lectures at the university. She wasn't exactly thrilled about her job, but it was a steady gig that fit well into her hectic student life. She had to get the bus to uni right after her shift, so it was critical that she didn't miss any time at the station. Despite the early wake-up time, there were upsides to the job. Once the initial rush of customers had passed, the station took on a certain stillness, and Laura often found herself alone in the small, isolated convenience store. She would slip into a comfortable routine, occasionally glancing up to serve a customer, but mostly lost in the pages of whatever book she happened to bring along. In these moments with the boss out of sight, she could relax and let the quiet fill the space. There was a sense of freedom in this solitude. It was a time where if her boss wasn't around, she could enjoy some peace, almost as though she were stealing moments for herself in a life otherwise filled with deadlines and obligations. One Tuesday morning, the routine was broken by the appearance of a customer who immediately caught her attention. As she was immersed in the pages of her book, a man walked into the petrol station, and his appearance stopped her mid-sentence. He was in his 40s or 50s, and as Laura looked up, she felt a sense of familiarity. Though it was an odd kind of familiarity, there was something about him that reminded her of the late Mark Bolan, the iconic frontman of the band T-Rex. Laura's father, who had passed away, had been a big fan of T-Rex, and she had spent countless hours flipping through his old vinyl records as a child. The cover of Unicorn, the album featuring Mark Bolan, had always captivated her as a young girl, and the face of the rock star had lingered in her memories. But this man who walked into the petrol station looked like an eerie mirror image of Mark Bolan. His hair was the same dark curly mop, and his eyes had the same tired look. However, there was a stark difference between the man in front of her and the musician whose face she remembered so well. This man looked gaunt, almost skeletal, as though someone had taken a sharp-edged layer of skin and stretched it over a brittle frame. His clothes, a tattered sheepskin coat, and a bright pink t-shirt paired with bell-bottom jeans, might have been stylish in a different time, but on him they just looked strange and out of place. Rather than evoking nostalgia or a sense of cool, the man's attire only made him seem weird and unsettling. Normally, Laura wouldn't pay much attention to the way people looked. A petrol station wasn't a place for high fashion or socializing. It was a stopover point for customers filling their tanks and grabbing snacks. Not a nightclub, so if a customer walked in looking like something out of a horror film, she would have shrugged it off. But this man's presence was different. It felt like something more than just the unusual way he looked. He had a strange air about him, something dark and off-putting that made Laura's skin crawl. Despite this, she remained professional, going through the motions of taking his order. The man grabbed a pint of milk from the fridge section, walked up to the counter, and asked for fuel. Laura processed the transaction, automatically handing him his change and thanking him as she did with every other customer. Usually after this, the customer would say something like, "Cheer, love and leave." But this man lingered instead of walking out the door. He stayed at the counter, his gaze fixed on her, and then out of nowhere he spoke, making a comment that made Laura's heart skip a beat. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" His voice was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly drawn out. He emphasized pretty in a way that made Laura's stomach turn. The inflection was off, almost as though he were speaking to a child, not an adult woman. Laura wasn't great at accepting compliments. But this was different. The man's voice had a greasy quality to it, a strange and uncomfortable way of speaking that immediately put her on edge. He wasn't offering a simple, benign compliment. This was something else, something darker. It wasn't just the words, but the way he said them, with a hint of something predatory beneath the surface. It was as if he was waiting for a reaction from her, perhaps trying to gauge whether she would accept the compliment and flirt back. Laura, trying to keep her composure, responded with a polite, reserved, "Thank you." She stepped away from the counter, hoping the man would take the hint that she was busy and couldn't chat. This was a trick she had learned over time: pretend to be busy, and most men would leave her alone. Most men, that is, but not this one. He didn't take the hint. Instead, he grew more insistent, stepping closer to her, speaking again, in that sickeningly slow, deliberate way. He insisted that he didn't get the chance to talk to women like her often and wanted to make the most of it. Laura, feeling her discomfort rise, tried to politely explain that she had work to do and couldn't continue the conversation. But he wasn't having it. He was persistent, crossing boundaries and making her feel increasingly trapped in her own workplace. He told her that he could deal with her boss if he had an issue with it. This disregard for her boundaries, coupled with his increasingly aggressive tone, made it clear that this man wasn't just a random customer. He was a threat. At this point, Laura knew she had to act decisively. She repeated that she was on the clock, but the man only became more belligerent, making crude comments, and even telling her that he wished he was as pretty as she was. Each word that came from his mouth made Laura feel more repulsed, but she remained calm, trying to manage the situation without escalating it. However, when he threatened her again, saying he could make her not so pretty, she realized she couldn't let this go on any longer. Laura, her hands shaking, pulled out her phone and pretended to call the police. It was a calculated risk. She knew the situation could escalate, but she had no choice. When the man heard her threaten to call the authorities, his demeanor shifted. He sneered, then threatened her with even more violent words, telling her he could come over the counter and smash her face in. The words felt like a physical blow. Laura's heart raced, and she finally had the courage to start dialing 911 for real. When the police arrived, Laura showed them the CCTV footage, and one officer immediately recognized the man. His name was Charles, or Chaz, and he had a history of harassing women. It turned out that Chaz was known for causing trouble at various locations, and the police had already received several complaints about him. Thanks to Laura's quick thinking, Chaz was eventually caught and taken into custody. The experience left her shaken, but grateful for the support of the police and the peace that followed. Though she never saw Chaz again, the encounter was a stark reminder of how dangerous some people could be. Even in the most ordinary of places, Laura's experience at the petrol station had been more than just a mundane job. It had been a daily battle of maintaining her composure and protecting herself from unwanted attention. She learned a valuable lesson that day. It's not always the obvious threats that you need to worry about, but the ones who lurk in the shadows waiting for the right moment to strike. Laura's routine at the petrol station had always been straightforward and unremarkable. She had grown used to the early mornings, the quiet lull after the morning rush, and the predictability of the job. That Tuesday, however, everything changed when a man walked into the station who at first glance seemed no different from the many regular customers who passed through the doors. But as soon as Laura looked up from her book, she felt a chill run down her spine. The man's appearance immediately caught her attention. He looked like the spitting image of Mark Bolan from the cover of the T-Rex album Unicorn, a memory from her childhood when she would sit with her father and flip through his old vinyls. Her dad had been a huge T-Rex fan, and Mark Bolan's face, youthful and full of charm, had always fascinated her. But this man was not the rock star she remembered. Instead, he looked like an eerie, almost malevolent twin. His dark curly hair was the same as were his tired eyes, but his features were sharper, more angular, and his face was unnaturally gaunt. It was as if someone had taken a skeleton and draped a thin layer of tissue paper over it, disturbingly fragile and unsettling. The man wore an outfit that in theory could have been vintage cool: sheepskin coat, bright pink t-shirt, and bell-bottom jeans. But instead of looking stylish or eccentric, he appeared dirty, strange, and creepy. His clothes were worn and tattered, and they only added to the bizarre impression he made on Laura. Normally, she wouldn't have thought twice about the appearance of her customers. A petrol station wasn't a place to judge anyone on their fashion sense. It was a stop for fuel snacks and brief exchanges. Even if someone walked in looking like they'd just escaped a horror movie, Laura would have gone about her business. But this man with his unnerving presence felt different. There was something off about him, something that made her instinctively wary. Despite her discomfort, she carried on with the transaction as usual. He grabbed a pint of milk and proceeded to the counter, asking for fuel. Laura took his payment, handed him his change, and thanked him in her usual polite manner. But this man didn't leave right away, like most customers did. Instead, he lingered at the counter, staring at her with a strange, unsettling intensity. When he finally spoke, his words felt out of place, jarring in their delivery. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" he said. The compliment, or whatever it was, hung in the air like a thick, suffocating cloud. Laura's skin crawled. She wasn't the type to be great at accepting compliments. She often felt uncomfortable with them, but the way he said it made her want to recoil. There was something greasy about his tone, something slimy that made her feel less flattered and more violated. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way he dragged out the syllables as if he were speaking to a child, not an adult woman. His tone was high-pitched and almost squeaky, as if he expected her to blush and giggle in response. But Laura wasn't a child. She was a grown woman, and the condescension in his voice, the blatant lack of respect, made her blood run cold. She knew she had to remain professional, but all she could do was nod stiffly, offering a quiet "thank you." Trying to step away from the counter without inviting further conversation. She had developed a strategy over time to deal with unwanted attention at the station. She would act busy, give the impression that she had work to do, and most customers would take the hint and leave her alone. But not this man. He didn't take the hint. Instead, he stepped closer to the counter, making Laura feel cornered, trapped in a conversation she didn't want to have. His gaze never left her. He began speaking again, telling her that he didn't get the chance to talk to women like her very often, and that he wanted to make the most of the opportunity. The uncomfortable knot in Laura's stomach tightened, and she instinctively took a step back. She tried to remain polite, explaining that she had to finish her work, but he wasn't having it. He stepped forward again, his voice taking on a hint of aggression, telling her that he was a customer and had every right to stay and talk to her. At this point, Laura was no longer just uncomfortable. She was beginning to feel threatened. Her thoughts raced as she tried to maintain composure. She knew she had to get out of this conversation, but she also knew that confronting him head-on might escalate the situation. She reiterated that she was on the clock and had work to do. But again, the man waved away her concerns, brushing off her attempts to excuse herself. Instead, he told her, "I wish I was as pretty as you." The words hung in the air, more unsettling than anything he had said so far. Laura's mind screamed in disbelief. Was he seriously saying that? His comment felt bizarre, almost creepy, like something out of a twisted fantasy. She could feel her face flush with irritation and discomfort. She wasn't trying to flaunt her looks or make herself the center of attention, but his strange remarks were becoming more than just uncomfortable, they were offensive. At this point, Laura knew she couldn't let this go on any longer. She had to draw a line. She politely told him that his comments were inappropriate for a professional setting. She emphasized that she didn't appreciate his remarks about her appearance. The man laughed a short, snide chuckle that sent another shiver down her spine. He then asked her, "Don't you like being pretty?" His voice was mocking, as if questioning her sense of self-worth. For the first time in the conversation, Laura couldn't find the words to respond. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to get out and leave her alone, but she knew it was safer to stay calm and composed. Instead, she turned her back, hoping he would get the hint and leave. But then he spoke again, his voice low and threatening. "If you don't want the attention," he said, "I can make you not so pretty." The words felt like a slap in the face. The threat was clear. He was no longer just creepy or inappropriate. He was now crossing a dangerous line. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Laura's veins. She knew she had to act fast. She turned, grabbed her phone, and pretended to dial the police. The man sneered, laughing at her attempt to defend herself. But as soon as he realized she was serious, his demeanor shifted. His voice grew deeper, more guttural, as he threatened her with violence. He told her he could smash her face in and make her unrecognizable. Laura's heart raced as she tried to maintain control of the situation. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her. She dialed 999 for real, her hands shaking as she spoke to the operator. The situation had gone from uncomfortable to dangerous, and Laura knew she had to stay calm to make sure the police arrived in time. The police came quickly, and when they saw the CCTV footage, they recognized the man immediately. His name was Chaz, and he had a long history of harassing women in similar situations. Laura learned that he had been reported numerous times before, but he had never faced any serious consequences for his actions. Thanks to Laura's quick thinking, Chaz was eventually arrested, and it was clear that he had been a threat to other women for years. The experience, while harrowing, taught Laura a valuable lesson. She had always been careful about who she interacted with at the station, but she hadn't realized just how dangerous some people could be. Her polite, reserved responses had worked most of the time, but there were people out there who would not respect boundaries, and she had to be prepared to handle those situations differently in the future. In the end, Laura's encounter with Chaz was a wake-up call, a reminder of the darker side of human nature. It made her realize how quickly a seemingly innocuous situation could turn into something frightening, and it gave her the courage to take control in moments of fear. While she hoped she would never have to deal with something like that again, she also knew that she was stronger for having faced it head-on. The morning shift at the petrol station had long been Laura's routine, a job she'd grown accustomed to over the years. With early mornings, quiet shifts, and a predictable set of customers, she'd found a rhythm that allowed her to juggle her university responsibilities and make ends meet. But that Tuesday morning, everything was disrupted when a man walked into the station, and Laura felt an unsettling chill run through her. He looked familiar in an uncanny way. As she glanced up from her book, her eyes fixed on a figure that seemed eerily like Mark Bolan, the iconic frontman of the band T-Rex whose albums her father had cherished. It was almost as if the spirit of Bolan had somehow been transported into the man standing before her. His dark curly hair, tired eyes, and sharp features were almost identical to the rock star, yet there was something deeply wrong with him. The man had the same scruffy mop of hair and intense gaze, but there was a gauntness to his face as if he were a living skeleton, covered by a thin layer of skin. His clothes, a sheepskin coat, a bright pink t-shirt, and faded bell-bottom jeans, seemed like something straight out of another era. But instead of evoking vintage charm, they made him appear unkempt, strange, and a little too theatrical, like someone desperately trying to hold on to a bygone image of cool that no longer suited him. Laura's discomfort deepened as she realized the man wasn't just eccentric. There was something darker in his presence that made her uneasy. In all her time working at the petrol station, Laura had dealt with all types of customers. Regulars, quirky personalities, and even the occasional rude customer. But this man was different. His appearance wasn't the issue. It was the aura he carried, a sense of unease that made Laura feel as though she were being watched. Scrutinized, she went through the motions of serving him, trying not to focus on his unsettling gaze. He grabbed a pint of milk, approached the counter, and asked for fuel. As Laura processed the transaction, she kept her composure, but something about his lingering presence made her skin crawl. When he took his change and prepared to leave, instead of turning away like most customers, he paused and began speaking to her. His gaze fixed firmly on her. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" he said, his voice drawn out and deliberate like a snake sizing up its prey. Laura felt a surge of discomfort that quickly turned into dread. She had never been good at accepting compliments, but this was different. His words weren't flattering. They were laced with something unsettling. The way he said it made her feel as though he were talking to a child, not an adult. There was a perverse edge to his voice, as if he expected a response, one that Laura was unwilling to give. Her mind raced as she tried to compose herself. She wasn't unfamiliar with unwanted attention, especially from male customers, who might throw out a casual hello or "how's your day going?" But this was something entirely different. The man's compliment didn't feel like a polite or friendly remark. It felt invasive, as though he were crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed, trying to remain professional. Laura gave a brief, polite response, "Thank you." But she knew this wasn't going to be a simple interaction. Her instincts screamed at her to back away, to put some physical distance between herself and the man, but she knew she had to handle this carefully. She tried to make it look like she had work to do, stepping back from the counter to give the appearance of being busy. She often used this tactic, acting like she had something to tend to, like stock or paperwork, and usually it worked. The majority of men, even if they attempted a flirtation or a comment, took the hint and walked away. But this man didn't take the hint. Instead, he stepped closer to her. His eyes locked on her, and his voice became more insistent. "I don't often get the chance to talk to someone as pretty as you," he said. Laura's stomach churned at his words, and she instinctively took another step back, trying to maintain some space between them. But he wasn't done. He was pushing, pressing further into her personal space, as if testing her limits, seeing how far he could go. Feeling trapped and unsure of how to handle the situation, Laura tried to explain that she was busy and couldn't continue talking. "I've got work to do," she said. But the man dismissed her words with a casual wave, not even pretending to care about her boundaries. "Well, I'm a customer, so I'm allowed to stay and talk to you," he said, his voice now tinged with a subtle aggression. The shift in his tone made Laura's heart rate spike. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was beginning to feel threatening. She had no idea what he would do next, but the unsettling feeling in her gut told her that this man wasn't someone to take lightly. She needed to find a way to end the conversation to get him to leave. But she also knew she had to remain calm. If she escalated things, she might put herself in even more danger. She tried again, explaining that she was on the clock and had to complete her duties, but he wasn't having it. Instead, he muttered something even more bizarre and inappropriate. "I wish I was as pretty as you," he said, his tone almost childish. This wasn't just a compliment anymore. It was an eerie, twisted comment that made Laura feel sick. She wanted to scream to lash out, but she knew better than to engage with someone who was acting this way. The man's behavior continued to spiral, and with each passing moment, Laura's unease deepened. She felt the walls closing in on her as he stepped even closer, invading her personal space. As he continued to make creepy comments, Laura's mind raced, searching for a way out. She couldn't let him intimidate her. "That's inappropriate for a professional setting," she finally said, trying to assert some authority. Though her voice was tight with fear, the man didn't take her seriously. Instead, he laughed a low, unsettling chuckle that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Don't you like being pretty?" he asked, his voice now tinged with mockery. At this point, Laura was done trying to be polite. She had to protect herself. "If you don't leave, I'll call the police," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. His response wasn't what she expected. Instead of backing off, he sneered and responded with something far more disturbing. "If you don't want the attention, I can make you not so pretty," he said. The threat was clear. Laura's stomach dropped. Her body went into autopilot as she reached for her phone, pretending to dial the police, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The man's face twisted in anger as he realized she wasn't bluffing. His voice changed, becoming darker, more guttural. He threatened her with violence, promising to smash her face in and make her unrecognizable. The words sent a cold wave of panic through her, but Laura held her ground. She dialed 999 for real, hoping that help would arrive soon. When the police finally arrived, Laura showed them the CCTV footage, and they immediately recognized the man. He was known as Chaz, and he had a long history of harassing women at various locations. Laura had unknowingly been another target in his disturbing pattern of behavior. Thanks to her quick thinking, Chaz was arrested, and Laura was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But the experience left her shaken. It had been a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk behind the facades of seemingly ordinary people. The incident had taught her to be more cautious, more aware of the signs of danger, and most importantly, that it was okay to stand up for herself. When someone crossed the line, Laura had been working at the petrol station for quite some time, and over the years she had grown used to the quiet rhythm of the job. Most days it was a simple routine of serving customers, keeping the store stocked, and managing her time between shifts and university lectures. The early mornings were tough, but she had adjusted to the schedule. There was a certain solitude to the job that she found both comforting and occasionally oddly refreshing. After the rush of the morning, when commuters and early risers would fill their tanks and grab a quick snack, the remaining hours of her shift were often quiet and predictable. As long as the boss wasn't around, she could even sneak in some reading or have a peaceful moment to herself. But that particular Tuesday morning, things took a strange and disturbing turn that would stay with her for a long time. It all began when a man walked into the petrol station. At first, Laura barely looked up from her book. It wasn't uncommon for customers to wander in and out without much fuss. But something about this man made her pause. She looked up and immediately noticed that he resembled Mark Bolan, the famous T-Rex frontman. Laura had grown up listening to her dad's records, especially T-Rex, and she remembered the striking image of Bolan on the cover of Unicorn. The man standing before her had the same dark curly hair, the same intense eyes, but there was something fundamentally different about him. He looked like a shadow of the rock star, gaunt, tired, and hollow, as though his body had been drained of life. His appearance was off-putting, and it left Laura feeling uncomfortable, though she didn't immediately know why. The man wasn't just an odd figure. He was unnerving. His clothes, a tattered sheepskin coat, a bright pink t-shirt, and bell-bottom jeans, seemed out of place, more fitting for someone who was trying to replicate an old-fashioned trend than wearing something that looked genuinely stylish. Instead of making him appear cool or eccentric, the clothes made him look strange, like a man desperately trying to cling to a past that no longer existed. Laura instinctively shifted her focus back to the counter, trying not to stare, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't just a customer. He was something else. As he grabbed a pint of milk from the fridge and brought it to the counter, Laura tried to carry on with her work, taking the payment and giving him his change. She said the usual thank you and waited for him to leave, hoping it would be a quick, uneventful exchange, but it wasn't. The man lingered. It wasn't uncommon for customers to chat briefly, but this man didn't move towards the door as expected. Instead, he stood there staring at her. Laura shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Then he spoke. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" His voice was low and slow, drawn out in a way that felt off. The compliment, if it could even be called that, was not delivered in a typical casual manner. It wasn't sweet or respectful. The way he said it, dragging out the word pretty, made Laura's skin crawl. It was as though he was talking down to her as if she were a child or something beneath him, and his tone was so off-putting that it immediately made her feel uncomfortable and threatened. At first, Laura didn't know how to react. She wasn't good at handling compliments in general, and this one was especially disturbing. She didn't want to be rude, but she also didn't want to encourage him. She mumbled a quick thank you and tried to step back, giving the impression that she had work to do. It was a trick she had used many times before, a simple gesture, to indicate that she was busy and couldn't chat. Usually that was enough to get customers to leave her alone, but not this man. He wasn't satisfied with a quick exchange. He stayed at the counter, continuing to fix his gaze on her, his eyes cold and calculating. I don't often get to talk to someone as pretty as you, he said, taking another step toward her. Laura's stomach churned. The man was becoming more persistent, and his words weren't just awkward, they were invasive. There was no denying the discomfort creeping up her spine. At this point, Laura's body tensed. She took another step back, trying to create some distance between herself and the man. She had dealt with odd customers before, but something about his presence felt more sinister. She realized that she needed to get away from him. She tried to politely explain that she had work to do, that she was on the clock, but the man wasn't listening. Instead, he brushed aside her concerns, saying he was a paying customer and had every right to stay and talk to her. His voice, though soft, had taken on an edge, something aggressive, something that made Laura's heart race with anxiety. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a harmless conversation. He was pushing her boundaries, and she needed to find a way to make him leave before the situation escalated further. Look, Laura said, trying to maintain her composure. I really need to finish my work. She hoped that this would finally send him on his way, but instead the man waved it off, brushing aside her words as though they didn't matter. He then told her, I wish I was as pretty as you, in a tone that was condescending and almost childish. Laura felt a mixture of anger and disgust at his remark, but she tried not to let it show. She wasn't about to engage with him further. She had already given him a polite but firm response, and she wasn't going to continue this conversation any longer. She tried again, more pointedly this time, saying that his comments were inappropriate for a professional setting, but he wasn't deterred. He laughed at her, a short mocking chuckle that made her skin crawl. Don't you like being pretty? He asked, his tone now dripping with mockery. By this point, Laura had had enough. The situation had crossed from uncomfortable to something far more disturbing. She could feel her pulse quicken as her mind raced for a way to get out of this situation. She turned her back on him, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But instead of respecting her boundaries, he pressed further. He stepped forward again, and the next words out of his mouth sent a cold wave of panic through her. If you don't want the attention, I can make you not so pretty, he threatened. The words were a direct threat, and Laura's stomach dropped as she realized the danger she was in. She knew she had to act quickly. This man wasn't just being creepy, he was becoming aggressive, and it was clear that he would not stop until he got what he wanted. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She reached for her phone and began to dial the police, her hands shaking as she held the device. The man sneered as if mocking her for trying to defend herself. He laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. His voice shifted, becoming deeper and more guttural as he threatened to smash her face in if she didn't comply. His words were chilling, and Laura could feel her hands shaking as she finally dialed 999 for real. She had to stay calm. She had no other choice. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her any longer. By the time the police arrived, Laura had managed to stay composed enough to explain the situation. They reviewed the CCTV footage, and one of the officers immediately recognized the man as someone known for similar behavior. He was arrested, and Laura was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Though shaken, she had done the right thing. She had stood her ground, called for help, and ensured that this man wouldn't hurt anyone else. It had been an experience that changed Laura forever, one that reminded her of the importance of listening to her instincts and never letting anyone cross the line. The encounter had been frightening, but she knew she had acted in the best way possible to protect herself. Laura had always found comfort in the quiet routine of her morning shifts at the petrol station. As a student at Loughborough University, the job was a reliable source of income, and its predictable nature allowed her to balance her academic responsibilities with her need for work. The early mornings were often a struggle, but once she settled into the rhythm of the shift, it became just another part of her day. The bustling morning hours gave way to a peaceful afternoon lull, when she could read or take a break between customers. On this particular Tuesday, however, the calm would be shattered by a customer who made Laura feel anything but at ease. She had just settled in with a book, one of the small luxuries of her morning shift, when a man walked into the station. At first, she barely glanced up, but something about his presence immediately caught her attention. When she looked up, her eyes locked on him, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he resembled Mark Bolan from the cover of the T-Rex album Unicorn. Growing up, Laura had been surrounded by her father's love of T-Rex, and she could still picture Bolan's striking face on the vinyl covers. The man in front of her, however, was no replica of the youthful, charismatic rock star. His face was gaunt and drawn sharp features beneath dark, unkempt, curly hair, a tired, hollow expression that made him appear skeletal. His clothes, an old sheepskin coat, a faded pink t-shirt, and bell-bottom jeans looked like they came from another era, but in a way that felt out of place rather than fashionable. It wasn't just his appearance that unnerved Laura. It was the unsettling vibe he exuded. His presence seemed to fill the space with an unspoken tension, a silent discomfort that hung in the air. Still, Laura had worked with all types of customers, quirky, rude, or awkward, and had developed a sense of detachment when it came to dealing with people. She had grown used to the mundane interactions of gas station life, where her job was simply to serve customers and get through the day. But this man felt different. He approached the counter, grabbed a pint of milk, and asked for fuel, this normalcy of the transaction, only adding to the strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. Laura processed his payment, handed over his change, and thanked him, hoping it would be a quick exchange. But as she turned back to her book, she noticed he was still standing there, staring at her, his eyes never leaving her face. It wasn't a casual glance or a polite gesture. It was an unsettling, unblinking stare that made her feel as though she were being scrutinized. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively took a step back from the counter. When he spoke, his voice sent a chill down her spine. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" His words hung in the air, slow and deliberate. The emphasis on pretty feeling unnatural, almost mocking. Laura wasn't unfamiliar with compliments, but this was different. There was something about the way he said it that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were delivered with an edge that felt too predatory, too pointed. Laura didn't know how to respond. Compliments had always made her uncomfortable, and this one was no exception. She had always been someone who shied away from attention, preferring to stay under the radar. She tried to brush it off with a polite, neutral, "Thank you," hoping that would end the conversation, but it didn't. The man didn't take the hint. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze still locked on her as if trying to assert some kind of control over the space. Laura's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to end the conversation. She had learned to use body language to signal disinterest, to pretend to be busy, and most customers would pick up on it and leave. But not this man. He seemed to feed off the discomfort he caused, growing more persistent with each passing moment. "I don't get to talk to pretty young women like you very often," he said, his words now more insistent. His tone had shifted slightly, becoming more aggressive, though not overtly threatening. Yet Laura, feeling trapped, stepped back again, trying to create more space between them. She explained as politely as possible that she had work to do and couldn't chat, but her words fell on deaf ears. The man dismissed her excuse, saying that as a paying customer, he had every right to stay and talk. At that moment, Laura realized this wasn't just a strange encounter, it was becoming something more dangerous. The conversation quickly escalated. The man's insistence became more aggressive and his comments more bizarre. "I wish I was as pretty as you," he said, his voice dripping with an unsettling sincerity that made Laura's stomach turn. The words didn't feel like a compliment anymore. They felt like a twisted kind of ownership. Laura's discomfort grew to outright anxiety, and she struggled to keep her composure. She knew she needed to get out of this situation, but how? The man was now making it clear that he wasn't going to let her off the hook. She reiterated that his comments were inappropriate for a professional setting, trying once again to shut down the conversation. But instead of backing off, he laughed a short, mocking laugh that made Laura's heart race. "Don't you like being pretty?" he asked, his tone now mocking and condescending. Laura could feel her patience slipping, and her instinct told her to distance herself from him, physically and emotionally. She turned away from him, hoping he would finally get the message and leave. But instead, his voice followed her now with an edge that sent a bolt of fear through her chest. "If you don't want the attention, I can make you not so pretty." He threatened, his words dripping with malice. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to face him. The threat was clear. He wasn't just making uncomfortable comments anymore. He was now using his words to threaten her physical safety. Without a second thought, Laura Roth reached for her phone and pretended to dial the police. She knew this man wasn't going to stop on his own. She had to take action, or she risked the situation escalating into something far worse. The man sneered when he realized she was calling the police, but his demeanor shifted. He didn't back down. Instead, his voice grew lower, more guttural. "If you keep complaining, I'll come over this counter and smash your face in." He growled, the threat unmistakable. Laura's body went into full alert. She had to stay calm and focused, but fear clawed at her. She dialed 999 for real, her hands shaking as she spoke to the operator. She explained the situation as quickly and calmly as she could, knowing that help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours as she watched the man's every move, half expecting him to lunge at her. When the police arrived, they quickly reviewed the CCTV footage. One of the officers recognized the man immediately. His name was Charles, or Chaz, and he had a long history of harassing women in similar situations. It wasn't the first time he had been reported for such behavior, and the officers were quick to arrest him, ending the encounter. Laura, still shaken, felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done everything right, but the experience had left her rattled. The knowledge that she had faced a dangerous person and had remained calm enough to protect herself was a small comfort. But the encounter reminded her of the very real dangers that could be lurking behind the mundane moments of her life. It taught her that sometimes, even in the most unexpected places, people can cross boundaries in ways that put your safety at risk. That day at the petrol station had been a wake-up call, but it also gave her a sense of empowerment, knowing that she could stand up for herself when it mattered most. The morning shift at the petrol station was something Laura had grown accustomed to, predictable, mostly uneventful, and a manageable way to earn extra money while attending university. Waking up early for her shifts became routine. The quiet mornings before the rush were her time to read, think, and breathe. She knew exactly what to expect from the regular customers who came in for fuel or snacks, and for the most part, life at the station was calm. But that Tuesday morning, the ordinary day would soon spiral into an encounter that would shake Laura to her core and leave her with a lingering sense of vulnerability. As she sat behind the counter, lost in a book, she heard the door chime and saw a man walk into the station. At first glance, he seemed like any other customer, a middle-aged man, perhaps in his 40s or 50s. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as Laura glanced up, something about him caught her eye in a way that unsettled her. He looked strangely familiar, yet at the same time completely off. There was something about his features that made Laura pause. His face, dark curly hair, and tired eyes reminded her of Mark Bolan, the iconic frontman of T-Rex whose music her father had adored. But this man wasn't a living version of the rock star she remembered. Instead, he seemed like an eerie impersonation, a twisted, ghostly version of Bolan. His features were gaunt, his face hollowed out in a way that seemed unnatural, almost skeletal. The man's appearance wasn't just startling, it was unsettling. His clothes, which at first glance could have been considered vintage, only added to the strange aura surrounding him. He wore a sheepskin coat, a faded pink t-shirt, and bell-bottom jeans. Outdated fashion that could have appeared quirky, if not for the way the clothes seemed to hang off him, worn and frayed in a way that made him seem out of place. He looked like someone trying to hold on to a past era, but his appearance only made him seem bizarre, dirty, and off-putting. Laura had seen all sorts of people at the station, but this man was different. He wasn't just a quirky customer, he was a presence that she couldn't shake, one that seemed to grow more uncomfortable the longer he lingered, as he grabbed a pint of milk from the fridge and approached the counter. Laura tried to maintain her composure. She had dealt with oddballs before, and she knew how to handle the casual flirtation or idle chit-chat that often came with the job. But this man was not like the others. There was an unspoken tension in the air as he approached. She took his payment, handed him his change, and said the usual polite thank you, hoping that would be the end of it, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stayed by the counter, looking at her in a way that made Laura's stomach tighten with unease. The silence stretched on uncomfortably as Laura tried to look busy, feeling the weight of his stare. Finally, the man broke the silence. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" His voice, though low and deliberate, didn't carry the warmth of a casual compliment. Instead, it came out slow, almost mocking, as though he were speaking down to her, not as a grown woman, but as a child or an object. His tone was condescending, and his words lingered in the air, unnerving in their delivery. Laura had always found it difficult to accept compliments, but this wasn't just an awkward moment. It felt like a violation. The man's words didn't make her feel flattered or seen. They made her skin crawl. She was caught off guard by the uncomfortable sensation creeping up her spine as he stood there looking at her with those cold, piercing eyes. Laura realized this wasn't just another awkward interaction. It was something more sinister, trying to remain polite. Laura gave a short thank you and hoped he would take the hint and leave. But instead of walking out, the man stood there, staring at her with unnerving intensity. I don't get to talk to girls as pretty as you very often. He continued, his voice taking on a new edge, more insistent, more invasive. Laura's stomach twisted in knots. She shifted uncomfortably, feeling trapped. It wasn't as if she could simply walk away, not without provoking something that she was not prepared for. She tried to politely excuse herself, explaining that she was on the clock and had work to do, but the man dismissed her attempts with a wave of his hand. I'm a customer. I have every right to stay and talk to you, he said. The words hung in the air and Laura's unease deepened. Something in his tone, his presence made her feel like she was being cornered, her own discomfort adding to the mounting tension between them. The man's behavior was quickly escalating from mildly awkward to outright disturbing. Then the man leaned in a little closer, and his next words sent a cold chill down Laura's spine. I wish I was as pretty as you. The comment was not only inappropriate, but downright creepy. Laura felt her blood run cold. It wasn't just a compliment or a joke. It was something that carried a sense of entitlement, as if he believed he had the right to make such comments, and that she should accept them. Laura's face flushed with a mixture of anger and revulsion. She had to get him to leave, but the more she tried to politely excuse herself, the more persistent he became. It's a shame, he said, because I could have had a lot of fun with someone like you. The insinuation in his voice made her stomach turn. At this point, Laura was no longer trying to be polite or professional. She was trying to stay safe. She stepped away from the counter, instinctively trying to distance herself. But the man followed her. His steps slow, deliberate. He wasn't going to let her go. The situation had gone from uncomfortable to downright dangerous. Laura's mind raced. She knew she had to act and fast. I really don't appreciate these comments, she said, trying to sound firm. She took a deep breath, then added, if you don't leave, I'll call the police. The man chuckled almost mockingly, as if he didn't believe her. His tone shifted again, becoming more aggressive, the words now dripping with menace. You really going to call the police just because someone called you pretty? His voice was cold and challenging, and that's when Laura realized just how much danger she was in. This wasn't just a creepy encounter. It was escalating into something far more threatening. Without hesitation, Laura reached for her phone and dialed 9999, her heart racing. I'm calling the police, she said, trying to remain calm. The man's face twisted into a sneer when he saw she was serious, but he didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward again, his body language aggressive. He leaned in close and whispered something that would haunt Laura for days. If you don't want the attention, I'll make you not so pretty. The threat was unmistakable. Laura's mind was racing as she tried to stay composed. She couldn't afford to panic. Her hands shook as she dialed the police for real, the urgency of the situation setting in. The man's voice shifted again now, deep and guttural as he threatened to harm her physically. I'll come over this counter and smash your face in, he snarled. The words hit Laura like a punch to the gut. This man was not just creepy, he was dangerous. When the police finally arrived, Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. They reviewed the CCTV footage, and immediately one of the officers recognized the man. His name was Chaz, and he had a history of harassing women, particularly in situations where they couldn't easily escape. Thanks to Laura's quick thinking, he was arrested. She had done everything right. She had stayed calm, called for help, and ensured her safety. It was a terrifying experience, but one that ultimately ended with the man being taken into custody. The relief was palpable, but so too was the realization that Laura would never again take her safety for granted. The encounter had changed her, but it had also empowered her, proving that she could handle difficult situations no matter how frightening they seemed at first. The knowledge that she had stood her ground and survived the encounter would stay with her long after the man was gone. Laura had always found solace in the quiet routine of her job at the petrol station. The early mornings were long, but the quiet lull after the morning rush allowed her to read, think, and manage her day before heading off to university. As a student, the job was the perfect balance of simplicity and structure, giving her the flexibility to manage her lectures while providing her with enough income to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most days that was enough. For the most part, the customers were regulars or those passing through, and while there were occasional odd interactions, nothing had ever felt truly out of the ordinary. But that Tuesday morning, everything would change in a way she couldn't have anticipated. She had just sat down to read a book during the usual mid-morning lull when the door chimed, signaling the arrival of a customer. At first, she barely looked up, assuming it was just another brief stop by a regular. But then she saw him, a man who instantly caught her attention. His appearance was strange enough that Laura couldn't help but take notice. The man was in his 40s or 50s, but there was something about his face that felt wrong. His dark curly hair and tired eyes were eerily reminiscent of Mark Bolan, the frontman of T-Rex, a band her father had loved. Laura had grown up listening to her dad's records and had always found herself transfixed by Bolan's striking image on the album covers. However, the man before her didn't resemble the charismatic rock star of her childhood. Instead, he looked like a twisted, disheveled version of Bolan gone, hollow with sharp features that seemed too angular. He looked like someone who had been drained of all vitality, and his clothes an old sheepskin coat, a bright pink t-shirt, and faded bell-bottom jeans further added to the sense of unease. They seemed vintage, but not in a way that could be considered stylish. Rather, they made him look strange, worn out, and entirely out of place. Laura didn't usually pay much attention to the appearance of customers. It was a petrol station, not a nightclub, and she had grown used to the eccentricities of the people who walked through the door. But this man was different. There was something deeply unsettling about his presence. She tried to keep her focus on her book as he grabbed a pint of milk from the fridge and approached the counter. He seemed harmless enough, just another person stopping in for fuel, but the feeling of discomfort intensified as he drew nearer. Laura went through the motions of taking his payment and giving him his change, trying to appear calm, but she could feel his gaze lingering on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a customer. He was something more. He was watching her, studying her with unsettling intensity, and that was when he spoke. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" he said, his voice slow and deliberate, stretching out the word pretty in a way that made it sound almost mocking. Laura's stomach twisted. She wasn't great at handling compliments to begin with, but this one felt different. It felt invasive. His tone, the way he drew out the word, made it feel like he was talking down to her, not as an equal, but as someone beneath him. It made her skin crawl. She didn't want to encourage him, but she didn't want to be rude either. She muttered a quick, polite thank you and hoped that would be the end of it, but the man didn't move. He didn't walk away like most customers did after the exchange. Instead, he stayed by the counter, his eyes fixed on her as though waiting for something. Her pulse quickened as the silence stretched on. "I don't often get to talk to pretty girls like you," he continued, his words now more insistent. Laura felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just a simple, awkward compliment. His voice now carried a hint of entitlement, and the more he spoke, the more she could feel the tension rising in the air. It was as if he was testing the limits of her patience, seeing how far he could push before she responded. The line between a harmless customer and a dangerous one was beginning to blur, and Laura was unsure of what to do next. She stepped back slightly, hoping the physical distance would send the message that she wasn't interested in talking. But it didn't work. The man took a step closer, his eyes still locked onto hers, and before she could formulate a response, he spoke again. "I wish I was as pretty as you." He said the words now dripping with something darker, something unsettling. Laura's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just an awkward compliment anymore. It had morphed into something far more sinister. She tried to maintain her composure, but her mind was racing. She had dealt with creepy customers before, but this felt different. There was an aggression lurking beneath his words, a sense that he wasn't just trying to make a harmless comment, he was trying to assert some kind of control over her. "I really need to get back to my work," Laura said, her voice tight as she tried to distance herself even further. She took a step back and moved toward the stockroom, hoping that would be enough to signal the end of the conversation. But instead of taking the hint, the man followed her, his voice now a low murmur. "Don't walk away from me. I'm trying to talk to you." The aggression in his voice was clear, and it sent a jolt of fear through her. Her instincts screamed at her to leave the counter, but she didn't know if that would make things worse. Instead, she stood her ground, her mind racing as she struggled to figure out how to extricate herself from the situation without escalating it. Laura tried again to explain that she was working and didn't have time to chat, but the man wasn't listening. Instead, he began to speak in an increasingly disturbing tone. "I'm a customer, and I'm going to talk to you as long as I want." He said, his words now cutting through the air like a knife. He was pushing her boundaries in ways that felt dangerous, and with each passing moment, Laura felt more cornered. Her discomfort grew into full-blown fear as he continued to talk, now making comments about how he didn't often get to talk to a pretty girl like her. She felt trapped, unsure of what he might do next. At this point, Laura realized that she had to take action. The man wasn't just being inappropriate, he was becoming threatening. As his comments grew more bizarre and menacing, she stepped back and reached for her phone. She dialed the police, her hands shaking as she pretended to make the call. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The man sneered when he realized she wasn't bluffing, and his demeanor shifted. His voice deepened, and he made a chilling threat. "If you don't stop, I'll make you not so pretty." The words sent a wave of terror through Laura, but she didn't back down. She brought her phone up, ready to make the call for real. When the police arrived, they immediately recognized the man's face from their records. He was known for harassing women, and his history of creepy behavior was a red flag. Laura, though shaken, had done everything right. By staying calm and calling for help, she had ensured that the situation didn't escalate further. The police arrested the man, and after reviewing the CCTV footage, it became clear that Laura's quick thinking had prevented a potentially worse outcome. As the man was escorted out of the station, Laura let out a deep breath. She was relieved that the encounter was over, but the experience stayed with her, a reminder of how quickly a seemingly harmless interaction could turn dangerous. It had been a terrifying experience, but one that proved to her that she could handle a situation like this no matter how unsettling it was. Laura had always found the quiet, mundane nature of her job at the petrol station to be a welcome reprieve from the chaos of university life. Working early shifts allowed her the flexibility to study in between and gave her the stability she needed to balance her education with the responsibility of earning money. While it wasn't the most exciting job, it was predictable. The quiet mornings followed by the bustling midday rush and the solitude in between were familiar, comforting even. But on this particular Tuesday, the monotony of her routine was shattered by an unsettling encounter that would haunt her for weeks. She had just settled in as usual with a book to pass the time. The calm of the morning, punctuated only by the occasional customer, was a perfect backdrop for her early hours at the station. She had become accustomed to the people who passed through, many of them regulars who were easy to predict and easy to serve. But when the man walked into the station that day, she could feel something shift in the atmosphere. At first glance, he seemed just like any other customer, someone who had come in for fuel or a snack. But as Laura looked up, she felt an immediate, unexplainable sense of discomfort. There was something about him that felt off, as though his very presence was out of place. The man was in his 40s or 50s with dark curly hair and eyes that seemed too tired for someone of his age. But it wasn't just his appearance that threw her off. It was his strange resemblance to Mark Bolan, the lead singer of T-Rex. Laura's father had been a huge fan of the band, and growing up she'd spent many hours listening to their albums. Bolan's face on the cover of Unicorn was iconic, and it was a face that Laura had studied countless times. This man, however, was not Bolan. He was a twisted version of the rock star Gaunt, drawn with sharp features that made him look almost skeletal. He looked like someone who had been drained of life. His clothes, an old, worn sheepskin coat, a bright pink t-shirt, and faded bell-bottom jeans seemed out of place and far too shabby for someone trying to recreate the style of the 70s. The whole ensemble came across as an attempt at vintage, but instead of looking charming, it only added to his disheveled, creepy presence. It was as if he had stepped out of another time and place, and something about his appearance made Laura instinctively uneasy. Still, she did what she always did when faced with strange customers. She took his payment, handed over his change, and offered a polite thank you, hoping that it would end the interaction quickly. But instead of leaving, the man lingered. His eyes, cold and unblinking, remained fixed on her. He didn't move away as he normally would. He stood there studying her, and the longer he did, the more uncomfortable she felt. Her pulse quickened, and she found herself glancing nervously at the clock, hoping for a distraction, but there was none. After a few tense seconds, the man finally spoke. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" His words were slow, deliberate, drawn out in a way that made Laura's stomach churn. The tone of his voice felt wrong, too, insistent, too pointed, as though he was trying to make her feel small or somehow objectified. Laura was no stranger to receiving compliments, though she wasn't particularly good at accepting them. But this wasn't a normal compliment. This felt invasive. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way he said them, as though he were making some sort of unspoken claim over her. Her instincts told her to shut down the conversation, to get back to work and make him leave. She forced a tight smile and muttered a quick thank you, hoping that would be enough. But instead of moving away, the man only leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he spoke again. "I don't get to talk to girls like you." "Very often," he said, his voice now more insistent, more possessive. Laura felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could feel the space between them closing in, and every second that passed made her more and more anxious. She shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, but the man didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he took a step closer as though trying to draw her in. She instinctively stepped back, hoping to put distance between them. But the man was persistent. He wasn't going to let her slip away. "I wish I was as pretty as you," he said, his voice now dripping with an unsettling tone that made Laura's skin crawl. The comment was so bizarre, so out of place that Laura wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't a compliment. It was something else entirely. It felt like a demand, like he was trying to control the conversation, trying to control her. She felt the creeping dread rise within her, her discomfort turning into something much more visceral. He wasn't just talking to her. He was pressing her, invading her space, and it was making her feel trapped. "I really have to get back to work," Laura said, her voice a little more strained this time, trying to make it clear that she didn't want to engage any further. But the man wasn't listening. He ignored her words and moved closer still, his eyes locked onto hers. He was determined to stay in her space, determined to keep the conversation going. "You don't need to work," he said, his words now tinged with a strange entitlement. "I'd like to spend more time talking to you." Laura could feel her heart racing as the man's presence became more oppressive. The situation was rapidly escalating from uncomfortable to outright threatening. She wasn't sure what his intentions were, but she could sense that it wasn't just a harmless interaction. Something about him felt dangerous. Panic bubbled up inside her as she realized that she needed to get out of this situation. He wasn't going to stop on his own. He wasn't going to leave just because she had asked him to. She had to do something. She took a step back, making sure to keep the counter between them, and tried to sound as calm and professional as possible, though. Her voice betrayed the fear she felt. "I really can't chat right now. I have work to do," she said firmly. But instead of accepting her excuse, the man crossed a line that made her blood run cold. "Well," he said with a laugh, "I can make you not so pretty if you don't want the attention." The words were a direct threat, and for the first time Laura truly felt fear settle in her chest. Without thinking, Laura stepped back, her hand reaching for her phone as she dialed the police. She didn't know if she was overreacting, but the way the man had spoken to her made her feel unsafe, and she wasn't about to take any chances. The man laughed again, but this time the laughter was hollow, almost sinister. His voice deepened as he threatened her again, telling her that he could come over the counter and hurt her if she didn't comply with him. His words were chilling, and as she reached for her phone, Laura's hands trembled. The seconds felt like hours as she dialed 999. Her voice steady despite the rising panic. The man sneered at her, his aggression now fully on display. "You really think the police will do anything?" he taunted. But Laura didn't back down. She held her ground, repeating that she would call the police if he didn't leave. As the police arrived, the man's demeanor changed again from mocking to genuinely furious. Laura, still shaken, stood at the counter, watching as the police officers approached and quickly took control of the situation. The man was arrested, and the officers reassured Laura that she had done the right thing by calling for help. She watched as they reviewed the CCTV footage and confirmed that the man had been known to harass women in similar situations. The relief that washed over her was palpable. But even as the man was taken away, Laura couldn't shake the feeling of violation. The encounter had reminded her of how quickly things could go wrong, how a seemingly harmless situation could turn dangerous in an instant. But as the officers left, she felt a sense of pride as well. She had handled the situation with calm and resolve, ensuring that she was safe. Despite the fear, despite the shock, she had done what she needed to protect herself. The incident would stay with her for a long time, but she knew that she was capable of handling whatever came next. She had faced a terrifying experience and emerged stronger, her instincts sharp and her resolve firm. It was an encounter she would never forget, but it was also one that had taught her the importance of trusting her gut and the value of standing up for herself when it mattered most. Laura had always considered her job at the petrol station to be a simple one. The early mornings were a struggle, but the predictability of the work was something she appreciated. As a university student, the hours worked around her class schedule, giving her enough time to study in between. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. The customers were usually regulars or passing travelers just stopping in for a quick refuel or snack. But this particular morning, as she sat behind the counter with her book lost in the quiet rhythm of the shift, something felt off. The usual hum of the morning routine was interrupted when a car pulled up to the pumps. It wasn't anything unusual, except that as Laura glanced up, she noticed something strange. There was no one behind the counter. She waited, expecting the attendant to return shortly, but the minutes ticked by with no sign of him. She looked around again, her eyes scanning the interior of the station. The car parked in front of the pump seemed deserted as well. The driver was nowhere to be seen, nor was there any sign of the attendant who should have been working the kiosk. Laura's unease began to grow. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about the empty station felt wrong. It wasn't like the usual midday quiet. This felt different, like something had gone wrong. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the counter, and she wondered if she should go check the back office or perhaps the convenience store's storage room. But instead, she waited a moment longer, thinking it was perhaps a simple case of the attendant running a quick errand or taking a break. But after a few more minutes, still no sign of anyone. The tension in the air thickened, and Laura felt a deep instinctual sense that something wasn't right. Her eyes flicked to the glass door still locked, and the silence inside the convenience store felt heavier, almost suffocating. Her heart raced slightly as she stood up, glancing nervously around the station. There was still no sign of the attendant, and she realized now that she was feeling more anxious than usual. Something was off about this place today, something she couldn't quite pinpoint. She moved toward the door of the convenience store, hoping to find either the attendant or an explanation for the strange stillness. When she reached the door, she tried the handle. To her surprise, it opened easily, and as she stepped inside, her unease turned to full-blown anxiety. The store was completely empty. The aisles were eerily quiet, the bright fluorescent lights flickering overhead. She called out hello, but her voice bounced back at her, swallowed by the silence. Her heart began to race faster as she took a few steps further into the store. Every instinct told her to leave, to run out the door and drive away. But curiosity and the need for answers kept her grounded. She walked to the back of the store, her steps slow and deliberate. There was no one in the office, no one in the stockroom, and the bathrooms were eerily empty too. The back door, which should have been locked, swung open easily when she pushed against it, revealing an empty, quiet parking lot behind the station. The feeling of being watched crept over her, and she froze for a moment, not sure where to go next. She stepped back inside, trying to shake off the rising dread that was clouding her judgment. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the attendant was just running late, but something still didn't sit right. Her eyes scanned the station again. The car that had parked in front of the pump was still there, but the driver was nowhere to be seen. The man had left without a trace. The longer she stood there, the more unnerved she became. Her thoughts raced. Was this some kind of prank? Had something gone wrong, or was there something more serious happening? Her mind was running through all the possibilities, none of them comforting, none of them putting her at ease. The lack of any human presence was starting to feel deliberate, as though everyone had vanished for a reason. With her heart pounding, Laura turned back toward the counter and reached for her phone. She thought about calling the police, but what would she even say? There wasn't a crime happening, at least not that she could see. No one was hurt, and no one was missing. But the strange emptiness of the station had put her on edge. Still, she hesitated. There was no real reason to make the call. But the unease lingered, growing heavier in her chest with every passing second. She glanced around again, this time more carefully. That's when she noticed it, a flicker of movement outside the station, a shape moving quickly in the periphery of her vision. She stiffened, her pulse quickening. Was it the driver? Could it be the attendant coming back? Laura moved toward the window, her breath caught in her throat. As she peered through the glass, her eyes widened in disbelief. There, lying by the dumpster outside, were two bodies, two lifeless figures sprawled across the ground, their limbs twisted unnaturally. One of them wore a gas station uniform, the distinct black and yellow name badge that marked them as an employee. Horror gripped her chest. The bodies were in terrible condition, their clothes dark with stains. Her breath caught in her throat as she quickly grabbed her phone, dialing 911. She didn't know who or what she was calling about, but she had to act fast. There's a body. I found two bodies at the station. She stammered the words, coming out in a rush. I don't know what's happened, but I need help right now. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she walked away from the window, trying to think clearly. She couldn't look at the bodies any longer, the sight of them already etched into her mind in vivid detail. She had to stay calm, keep it together. The dispatcher on the other end of the line was asking questions, But all Laura could focus on was the fact that she had just found two dead bodies at the back of a deserted petrol station in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation as to how they had gotten there or what had happened to them. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she leaned against the counter for support. The tension in her chest seemed to grow with each passing second, and she realized that this wasn't just some random incident, it was something far worse. The dispatcher promised that help was on the way, but the minutes felt like an eternity as she waited in the now empty station. Her mind kept racing. What had happened to the attendant? To the driver of the car? Why had she been the one to find the bodies? The police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the heavy silence of the station. Laura was relieved to see them, but she still couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled into her bones. As the officers processed the scene and reviewed the CCTV footage, they confirmed the worst: the gas station attendant, along with the driver of the car, were now part of a grim mystery. The bodies were examined, and it became clear that the gas station had become the scene of something much darker than a simple robbery gone wrong. The authorities quickly cordoned off the area, and Laura was questioned about what she had seen, but the unsettling questions remained. What had led to this moment? How had two lives ended up discarded so callously outside her place of work, and how had she been the one to discover them, the lone witness to the horror unfolding in her quiet, predictable world? The answers were far from clear, and the fear lingered long after the police had left, leaving Laura with a newfound wariness that would stay with her for a long time. The calm and predictability of Laura's morning shift at the petrol station were the kind of routine she had come to rely on. As a university student, working early shifts at the local petrol station gave her the perfect balance between earning money and having enough time for her studies. On most days, the work was monotonous, offering plenty of quiet hours to read, think, or daydream between the occasional rush of customers. But that particular morning, everything shifted. She was seated behind the counter, her attention focused on a book in her lap when she heard the faint chime of the door. At first, Laura didn't look up, assuming it was just another customer stopping by to grab a quick snack or refuel their car. But then, after hearing no sounds of footsteps approaching, she glanced up from her book and saw something unusual. The person who had entered the station was at first glance completely ordinary, except for the unsettling presence he gave off. He looked to be in his 40s or 50s with dark curly hair and an appearance that seemed to grab her attention more than she had expected. There was something vaguely familiar about his face, and for a moment Laura couldn't place it. But then it hit her. His features reminded her of someone she had seen before, specifically the cover of her father's T-Rex albums. The resemblance to the late Mark Bolan, lead singer of the glam rock band T-Rex, was uncanny, except this man looked like a ghostly, distorted version of the singer. The man's dark, tired eyes seemed hollow, and his gaunt, sharp features made him look almost skeletal. His appearance was jarring, strangely familiar, yet repelling. Laura tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. It wasn't uncommon for customers to look eccentric, and the station was far from a glamorous setting. The station served as a quick stop for those driving through, often attracting a mix of people from all walks of life. But there was something off about this man. His attire, an old sheepskin coat paired with a bright pink t-shirt and bell-bottom jeans, felt out of place. But more than that, it looked shabby and unkempt. The vintage aesthetics of his clothing was clearly not intentional. It seemed like the kind of outfit someone would wear if they hadn't bothered to care for it, or themselves, for a long time. As he picked up a pint of milk and walked up to the counter, Laura quickly went through the motions, ringing up his purchase, offering him the usual polite thank you, and handing over his change. But instead of walking away, the man lingered at the counter, his eyes now fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort that seemed to hang in the air between them. She thought he would eventually move on like most customers, but he stood there staring at her as though expecting something more. After a few moments of silence, the man broke it with a remark that made Laura's heart skip a beat. "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" His voice was smooth but slow, drawing out the word pretty in a way that made her skin crawl. It wasn't the typical comment one might hear at the petrol station. No, this had a different edge to it, an underlying condescension that made Laura's stomach turn. She wasn't used to taking compliments from strangers in the first place, but something about this one felt gross, like he was speaking down to her, reducing her to an object instead of a person. His voice wasn't warm or playful, it was something else entirely. She tried to mask her discomfort with a brief thank you and hoped he would take the hint. But instead of leaving, the man stayed put, his gaze unwavering. The words he had spoken had already made her uneasy, but now she was truly beginning to feel trapped. She wanted to retreat into the stockroom away from his gaze, but that would be awkward, and she didn't want to escalate the situation. She could feel the anxiety bubbling up inside her as he continued to stare, his expression growing more intense. "Don't you like being pretty?" he asked, his voice taking on a new high-pitched quality, almost as if he were speaking to a child. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a compliment, it was a demand, a strange and uncomfortable assertion of power. He was sizing her up, assessing her, and something in the way he spoke made her feel like he thought he had a right to her attention, a right to invade her space. Her nerves were on high alert, and she knew she had to do something. But she didn't want to risk confronting him outright. What if he was dangerous? She wasn't sure what his intentions were, but at that moment she realized that it was no longer about just getting through the encounter politely. She had to protect herself. "I really can't chat right now," she said, her voice tighter than she'd intended. She tried to make it clear that she was busy, but it only seemed to encourage him. He leaned in closer, his eyes still locked on hers. "I wish I was as pretty as you." He said the words now even more unsettling. Laura's heart raced and she took a small step back, her instincts screaming at her to get away. But she was cornered. She needed to get out of this situation before it escalated further. She fumbled for an excuse, something, anything to get him to leave. "I really need to get back to work," she said, her voice unsteady now. But the man was relentless, continuing to linger, continuing to push her boundaries with his bizarre comments. "It's a shame," he said with a sneer. "I could have had a lot of fun with you." Laura's mind was spinning. Her discomfort had now turned into fear. The way he spoke, the confidence with which he continued to speak to her, made her feel powerless. She had to leave, but she didn't want to provoke him. Finally, Laura decided to take control of the situation. She had to make it clear that this wasn't a normal encounter. "I need to work," she repeated, stepping back toward the counter, trying to distance herself, but the man didn't listen. Instead, he raised his voice now, increasingly aggressive. "You're just going to walk away from me," he demanded. "I'm a customer." It was as if he believed he had every right to stand there talking to her, making her uncomfortable. And that's when he crossed the line. "If you don't want the attention, I'll make you not so pretty." The words were a direct threat, and Laura froze. She felt the blood drain from her face as a cold shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't just an awkward situation. It was now an outright danger. Laura didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed 999, trying to stay calm despite the fear that gripped her. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens a welcome sound that signaled safety. As they apprehended the man and reviewed the CCTV footage, it quickly became clear that Laura had been right to call for help. The man had a history of harassing women, and the officers recognized him immediately. He was arrested, and Laura's quick thinking had ensured that he wouldn't escalate the situation any further. Relief washed over her, but even as she watched him being taken away, she realized the true weight of what had just happened. The encounter would stay with her for a long time, a reminder of how quickly a seemingly harmless situation could turn dangerous. But despite the fear, despite the anxiety, Laura had stood her ground and had done what was necessary to protect herself. It had been a terrifying experience, but she knew she had done the right thing.